The unexpected encounter. The planet Earth was unlike any world the alien woman had ever visited. It was strange, raw, wild, and full of life. She had traveled across galaxies, encountering different species, witnessing their strengths, their weaknesses, and their endless struggles for power. But humans, they were different. She had heard rumors, but she never expected to feel it for herself. The alien woman, tall and powerful, stood on the rocky cliff that overlooked a vast city. Her sharp eyes scanned the streets below, her mind calculating every detail. She was an elite warrior, a being of unmatched strength and grace. To her, the human world seemed fragile and unremarkable, but that's when she saw him. He stood on the edge of the street, looking up at her as though he didn't see a towering figure of power, but simply another person. His eyes were calm, steady, and confident, not filled with fear like every other human she had encountered. She had expected people to flee, to cower at the sight of her. She was a queen, a conqueror in her own right. But he stood still, as if nothing was unusual. Curiosity sparked inside her. Why isn't he afraid? She studied him more closely, observing his posture. There was something different about this human. His body language was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, taking in everything around him. Most humans would have been too afraid to even make eye contact with her, but he didn't look away. His expression was neutral, almost as if he had seen many things in his lifetime that were far more threatening than her. The alien woman didn't know why she felt a strange pull towards him. It was something she hadn't experienced before, a curiosity, something soft in her mind that she didn't recognize. She dismissed it. Perhaps he's just another curious human, waiting to be dominated. But she wasn't so sure. The human didn't speak, didn't move, but she could feel his presence. There was a quiet strength in him, something that made the air around her tense. Maybe he's one of those rare humans who don't fear death, she thought. That was the only explanation she could come up with. Humans were all too eager to die for their causes, but they usually ran from what they feared. Not this one. She took a step forward, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Her towering frame cast a shadow over him, but he remained still, unshaken. The closer she got, the more she felt an odd sensation, an unfamiliar feeling running through her veins. "What do you want, human?" Her voice was low, almost menacing. She wasn't used to being ignored or underestimated. For a long moment, the human didn't respond. He simply studied her with an intensity that she had never experienced before. The silence between them grew, thickening the air. She could feel the strange pull intensifying, like a magnetic force drawing her closer to him. It was uncomfortable. She had never been vulnerable in this way, never had someone's gaze make her question everything she knew. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, cool. "What do you want?" The words weren't a challenge, nor were they filled with fear. They were simple, yet they held weight. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, her sharp mind quickly processing his words. "What do I want?" She was confused. Why does he ask me that? She, who had taken what she wanted by force in every corner of the galaxy, was now questioned by a human. A being so small, so fragile compared to her, had the audacity to ask what she wanted. "I am the one who asks the questions," she said, her voice more firm this time. But the human only nodded slowly, still not breaking his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something fierce, almost defiant, yet full of patience. It was like he knew something she didn't, like he was aware of the fact that she was trying too hard to maintain control of the situation. She shifted, feeling a twinge of discomfort. What is this feeling? Her gaze dropped to the ground briefly, her mind racing. She had never felt this kind of hesitation before, never questioned herself when standing in front of her enemies. "I am a conqueror, a queen. Why do I feel this way?" She snapped her focus back on him. The human was still watching her, still calm, as though he were waiting for her next move. She stepped closer, towering over him now. The human looked up at her, unblinking. There was something undeniable in his expression, a quiet confidence that almost felt like strength. "Do you not fear me?" she asked, her voice softer than before. She was aware of the odd vulnerability creeping into her tone. He simply shook his head. "No, you haven't given me a reason to." Her heart skipped a beat. No one had ever said something like that to her. Most people, even the most powerful beings she had faced, feared her. But this human, he didn't even blink. For a moment, she almost forgot why she was here. This human wasn't afraid. This human was something else. There was a moment of silence before she spoke again, her voice lower this time. "I can make you fear me, human." He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Maybe, but I'd rather get to know you first." The alien woman's mind went blank. She couldn't decide if she was intrigued or annoyed. He had shown no fear, but he wasn't foolish either. There was something in the way he spoke that made her feel strangely human. And that was the moment she realized, this human might be more dangerous than I thought. The mysterious force. The alien woman stood still, her eyes locked onto the human, feeling a strange weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had never encountered anyone who dared to look at her like that, who stood their ground without fear or hesitation. He should be terrified by now. He should be kneeling before me. But instead, the human remained calm, his gaze unwavering, almost as if he knew something she didn't. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what was happening inside her. The air around her seemed to thicken, vibrating in a way she couldn't explain. There was something in this moment, something in the way he made her feel, that made her question everything. She had traveled across galaxies, conquering worlds, and yet, standing before this human, she felt vulnerable. "It's just a human," she reminded herself. "He's nothing compared to me. I faced armies, beasts, and gods. This human is insignificant." But as much as she tried to convince herself, something within her was stirring. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, more unsettling. A pull that made her chest tighten. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to ignore the strange sensation, pushing it down with her will. Focus. I must remain in control. She stepped back, trying to regain her composure, but the moment she did, the sensation only grew stronger. The warmth was back, pulsing in her chest, spreading through her body like an invisible force. What is this? Her hands clenched into fists, and for a split second, she felt her power surge. But then something unexpected happened. The human, still standing there, said nothing, but his presence seemed to become more intense, like an unseen force radiating off of him. The alien woman felt a shift, a change. It was as though the very air around her was alive, responding to him in ways she couldn't understand. She instinctively took a step back, trying to escape the feeling that was creeping up on her, but it was futile. Her body was responding to something she had never experienced. She had always controlled her surroundings, her enemies, with absolute certainty. But now, for the first time, she felt like the one being controlled. The human tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "What is it?" he asked softly, his voice calm, as though he could sense the conflict inside her. "You're not used to this, are you?" His words were simple, but they cut through her like a blade. He knows. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. This human, this insignificant being, had an understanding of her that she couldn't explain. The alien woman opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt tight, constricted by something she couldn't name. She hated this. She hated that for the first time in her life, she felt like she was losing control, and to a human no less. She had conquered entire planets, faced down the fiercest of adversaries, and yet here she was, standing before a man who had no fear of her. She clenched her fists tightly, trying to push away the foreign feelings. But the more she fought it, the stronger they became. It was as though the very air was charging with energy, crackling between them. The space around her hummed, vibrating with an unseen force that was drawing her closer to him. The human's voice broke through her thoughts again, calm and steady. You don't have to be afraid. Afraid, her. The alien woman's pride surged within her, and she took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weakness she felt. I am not afraid, she replied, her voice firm, but even to her, it sounded uncertain. But the human didn't respond with words. Instead, he took a single step forward. The movement was simple, almost casual, but to the alien woman, it felt like a challenge. The air around her seemed to crackle, thick with energy, and her heart raced as if it recognized the danger before her mind did. Her instincts screamed at her to attack, to strike before he could do anything, but she resisted. Something in the human's presence made her pause. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each passing second. The warmth in her chest was now overwhelming, radiating out from her core. The human stepped closer still, and with each step, the strange force grew stronger. The alien woman could feel it now. She wasn't just sensing something from him. She was sensing something within her. It was as though the very essence of her being was responding to him. It wasn't physical strength. It wasn't his words. It was something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the battle or the war she was so accustomed to. No, she thought, shaking her head. This is not possible. No one has the power to affect me like this. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized he wasn't just an ordinary human. The force coming from him wasn't of this world. She could feel it now, deep inside her, the way it was pulling her, drawing her in. Why don't you fight it? The human asked, his voice a mere whisper, but it carried weight. Why not accept it? The words sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just a question, it was an invitation. To surrender, to feel, and for the first time in her life, she considered it. The alien woman's hand trembled slightly, and she instinctively clenched her fists tighter. But it didn't help. She could feel the power inside her, shaking loose from its usual restraints. The human had found something within her, something she had never known existed. She couldn't resist. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, the force growing stronger with every inch. And as their eyes met, she finally understood. This was not something she could fight. It was something she had to embrace. Unraveling the mystery. The alien woman took another step, almost as if drawn by an invisible force. Her feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling her toward the human. She could no longer deny it. Something was happening, something she could neither understand nor control. The strange sensation that had started as a mild discomfort had now become an all-consuming presence, filling her chest and mind with confusion. What is this power? She thought. I am no longer in control. Her body had always been her weapon, her greatest strength. Her sharp senses, her enhanced speed, her indomitable will. These were the things that made her an elite warrior, a conqueror of worlds. But now, standing before this human, she was becoming aware of a new power, one that had nothing to do with physical strength or battle tactics. It was an invisible force, an intangible presence that made her question everything she knew about herself. She stared at him, her mind racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. The human hadn't moved since the moment he stepped forward. He simply stood there, calm and unflinching, as if he were waiting for something. Waiting for her to break. She hated this. She was the one who broke others, who watched their strength crumble beneath her. She had never allowed herself to be weak, not in front of anyone, and certainly not in front of a human. But as much as she fought it, she felt herself being drawn in. It wasn't just his presence, it was something deeper, something that she had never encountered before, a pull that resonated with her very being, making her feel alive in a way she had never felt before. She had always known power. She'd have felt it surge through her countless times, in battles, in wars, and in moments of victory. But this was different. This was not power in the way she understood it. This was a force that seemed to originate not from her, but from the human. She tried to resist, tried to pull away from it, but every time she did, the force only grew stronger. Her breathing became shallow. She had to understand what was happening. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, a crack in her usual composure. Her eyes searched the human's face for some sign of an answer, something that would make sense of the chaos building inside her. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, closing the distance between them. The alien woman's breath caught in her throat. The pull of his presence was undeniable now, as though it was an extension of herself, something she had been missing all along. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice lower, almost a whisper. It wasn't a question of dominance, but of curiosity, of desperation. She was no longer sure of what was real. The human's gaze softened, but his voice remained calm. "I don't want anything from you, except to help you understand." "Understand what?" Her voice was sharp, but there was uncertainty behind the words. "Understand that you don't need to fight all the time," he said. His tone was steady, as if he were teaching a lesson. "You've spent your whole life conquering, dominating, but you've never learned how to feel, to let yourself experience the world without the weight of power on your shoulders. You've never let yourself be vulnerable." Her heart raced. No one had ever spoken to her like this. She, who had fought countless battles, who had learned to rule entire civilizations with fear and strength, was now being told she didn't know how to live. It stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. "No one taught me how to feel," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I never had the luxury." The human looked at her with something akin to pity, but it wasn't condescending. It was understanding. "You don't need a luxury to feel. You just need to let go. Let go of the control you cling to." She shook her head, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Let go. She had never let go. Control was her shield, her armor. It was what kept her strong, what kept her alive. But now, in front of this human, her shield felt like a prison. The sensation inside her grew more intense, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with battle, nothing to do with power. It was a strange, sweet feeling, like the warmth of sunlight after a long, cold night. She had never known it before, and it terrified her. The human stepped even closer, until there was only a breath between them. The alien woman could feel his presence all around her, but it wasn't threatening, it wasn't overpowering. Instead, it felt like a steady rhythm, something familiar, something natural. She had expected to feel fear, but instead she felt safe. That was the last thing she had ever expected to feel in the presence of a human. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do you do this?" The human smiled, a simple, almost sad smile. "I'm just a human. But I know what it's like to be alone in your own mind, to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And sometimes we forget that we don't have to do it all by ourselves." His words struck deep into her soul, breaking through the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Alone. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to feel lonely, to feel the weight of her isolation. But now, in this moment, it hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She looked away, her chest tightening. She wanted to fight it, to shove it all back down, but she couldn't. The feelings were too strong now, too real. I don't know how to stop it," she said, her voice small and fragile, a rare crack in the otherwise impenetrable exterior she had spent centuries perfecting. The human placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't recoil. "You don't have to stop it. Just let yourself feel. It's okay to be more than just a warrior. You can be something else." The alien woman closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking into her very core. She was starting to understand now. This wasn't about strength or control. This was about living. For the first time, she realized she had been living in a cage of her own making. The first test, the alien woman stepped back, her mind still reeling from the human's words. There was a storm inside her, a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that she couldn't quite make sense of. She had been a conqueror, a destroyer, a queen of battle. Nothing had ever made her hesitate before except this human. He was not like the others. He was not afraid, not awed by her power, and most of all he had made her feel weak. Weak, The word tasted bitter on her tongue. She took a deep breath, trying to push aside the growing feeling of vulnerability. No, she was no longer the uncertain being that had stepped into this world. She was a warrior, a force to be reckoned with. And as she could not control the emotions that surged inside her, she would control the battle. The human was still standing before her, waiting. She could feel the heat of his gaze, but this time there was no hesitation in her. She would prove to herself that she was still in command. She would test him. Her eyes narrowed. Enough of these games. If you are so sure of yourself, let us see if you can survive a test of strength. She stepped back, feeling the weight of her body shifting into a battle stance. The alien woman was a master in hand-to-hand combat, her every movement honed through years of ruthless training. There was no human alive who could match her in physical strength, no being who could rival her skills. The human raised an eyebrow, his expression calm, almost amused. A test of strength, that's what you want. He didn't sound threatened, not even the slightest bit. It was as though he had already accepted what was coming. The alien woman's eyes flashed with a fierce glint. Let him think what he wants. She had battled armies of alien creatures, warlords, and even gods. No human could stand against her in combat, not even one like him. With a swift movement, she lunged forward. The speed and power of her strike should have knocked him to the ground in an instant, but the human didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his arms just in time to block her strike. The force of her punch sent a shockwave through the air, but the human didn't budge. He held firm, his body tense with the effort of absorbing the blow. She could feel the muscles in his arms quivering under her strength, but he held his ground. She pulled back, staring at him in disbelief. How was he doing this? The human smiled, his face still calm. "I've faced worse." The alien woman growled in frustration. She swung at him again, faster this time, aiming for his torso. But to her surprise, he twisted his body just enough to avoid the blow, stepping aside with a fluid motion that she didn't expect. She had anticipated his movements, but the human had countered her with an agility that was unnatural for someone of his species. Impossible, she thought, her pulse racing. This human, he's not like any human I've ever encountered. She attacked again, this time with a flurry of blows, each one aimed to overpower him. But the human danced around her strikes, his body moving with an ease that defied his fragile appearance. She could feel the sweat forming on her brow as the battle continued. Why is he so quick? Every time she thought she had him cornered, he slipped out of her grasp, his movements becoming more and more fluid, more unpredictable. For the first time in a long time, she began to feel the strain. This shouldn't be happening. She paused, taking a step back, her breath heavy. The alien woman's pride had never been so bruised. The human, despite being far weaker than her, was forcing her to fight harder than she ever had before. She had underestimated him. She had assumed that, because he was human, he would be easy to defeat. But now her confidence was shaken. The human stopped moving for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't breathing heavily like she was. "How? Are you done?" he asked simply, his voice calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been under attack. "You're stronger than I expected, but that doesn't mean you're invincible." Her chest tightened at his words. Invincible. She had never felt vulnerable in her life, and yet, here she was, standing before a human who had just given her a taste of what it meant to lose control, to be pushed to the limit. "You think you can beat me, human?" Her voice was a low growl, her temper flaring. She was a queen, a conqueror. No one had ever made her feel like this. But instead of responding with arrogance or fear, the human simply smiled again, that same calm, confident smile. "I'm not trying to beat you. I'm trying to show you that there's more to strength than just power." She stared at him, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. Was this part of his plan? To prove that physical strength didn't matter? To make her question her abilities? "I don't need your lessons," she spat, stepping back, her pride burning hotter than ever. I know what true strength is." But as the words left her lips, she couldn't shake the feeling that the human was right. There is more to strength than just power. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized what he had done. He hadn't beaten her physically, but he had shown her that there were other kinds of strength that she had never allowed herself to consider. She couldn't understand it, but in that moment, a small seed of doubt began to form in her mind. What have I been missing all this time? The alien woman was still trying to process the overwhelming sensations swirling inside her. Her body was still ready to fight, but her mind was racing, questioning everything she had always believed. The human stood there watching her, as if waiting for her to make a decision. He hadn't won the fight, but in some way, he had won something far more significant. Her pride, her strength, and everything she had known was being called into question, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But for the first time, she wasn't certain about what would happen next. The emotional battle. The alien woman stood in the aftermath of the test, her breathing heavy, her heart pounding. The echoes of the battle still lingered in the air, but the human, surprisingly, hadn't even broken a sweat. He wasn't just physically resilient, he was mentally strong, something she hadn't expected. She, the mighty conqueror, was left questioning herself in ways she never thought possible. The battle had ended without a clear victor, and yet she felt as if she had already lost. The strange force that had been pulling at her, the feeling of vulnerability, of being less, was stronger than ever. She had been tested in ways she didn't understand, and with each passing moment, her sense of control was slipping further away. For the first time in her life, the alien woman wasn't sure who she was anymore. She turned away, her mind in turmoil, trying to regain the composure that had always been her foundation. She was a warrior, a queen, an apex predator. She had never allowed herself to show weakness, never let anyone see the cracks in her armor. But standing before this human, everything she had built, everything she had known about herself, felt like it was crumbling. The human's voice broke through her thoughts, calm and steady. "You've never let yourself be weak, have you?" She stiffened, her back straightening, but she didn't answer. She could feel his presence behind her, unwavering, unshaken. He was waiting for her to acknowledge what was happening, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to face the truth. "I don't need to be weak," she replied, her voice low, but filled with pride. "I am stronger than anyone. I don't need anyone to show me how to be strong." But her words didn't carry the weight they usually did. They felt hollow, even to her own ears. The power she had always relied on, her strength, her pride, wasn't enough to fill the void she was feeling now. The human, who had once been nothing more than an insignificant creature in her eyes, had managed to shake her very foundations. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't sure if she was stronger because of her power, or if she had been running away from something deeper inside herself all along. "I'm not here to make you weak," the human said, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I'm here to help you find a strength you've been denying." The alien woman's fists clenched, her sharp nails digging into her palms. "I don't need your help," she growled, but there was no conviction in her words. She knew it, and the human knew it. She could feel the hesitation in her voice, the uncertainty she had never allowed herself to show before. He was quiet for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. And then he asked a question that cut through her like a blade. "What are you afraid of?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. The question was too raw, too personal. She had never allowed herself to confront that part of her. Fear was something for others, something for the weak. She wasn't afraid of anything. She was a conqueror, a ruler. But deep down, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she had been hiding from for so long. She was afraid of what it meant to be vulnerable, afraid of being human in ways she had never allowed herself to be. And worse still, she was afraid that she would lose herself in the process. The human was still watching her, his gaze unyielding. "You don't have to hide from it," he said softly. "You're not a monster. You're a person, and there's strength in that." The words hit her like a wave, knocking the breath out of her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to regain control. But she couldn't. Not now. The emotional battle inside her had been raging for too long, and she was losing the fight. For a moment, she stood there, her entire body trembling with the force of everything she was feeling. The fear, the confusion, the anger, all of it swirling within her. She had spent her entire life conquering others, but now, for the first time, she was facing the thing she had never been able to defeat, herself. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her walls cracking with the weight of the admission. The human stepped closer, his presence warm and steady, like a hand reaching out in the dark. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to not know." She wanted to pull away, to shut him out, to maintain the cold distance she had always kept between herself and others. But something inside her, something she had never allowed herself to acknowledge, was pulling her in. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to be alone, and that terrified her. The human reached out a hand, not to dominate her, but to offer her something she had never experienced: understanding. He didn't need her to be strong all the time. He didn't expect her to be perfect. He simply wanted her to be real. The alien woman hesitated. The warmth in his eyes, the quiet acceptance he offered, broke through the walls she had spent centuries building. Slowly, as if her very body was fighting her every step of the way, she reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the most significant thing she had ever done. She had never allowed herself to be touched, never allowed herself to be vulnerable. But now with this human, she felt something she hadn't known she was missing. She wasn't just a warrior anymore, she was something else. And for the first time, that was okay. Unintended pleasures. The alien woman stood still, her hands still clasped in the human's. A small, quiet part of her recoiled at the intimacy, at the warmth of his touch, but another part of her, the part she had been hiding from for so long, felt something stirring deep within her. A sense of comfort, a sense of connection that felt both new and unnervingly familiar. She had always believed herself to be untouchable, above the need for affection or companionship. Her entire existence had been about dominance and control, about standing above all others, untouched by weakness. But now, in the presence of this human, those beliefs felt less certain, less invincible, and it terrified her, but it also intrigued her. The human didn't speak. He didn't try to pull her closer or demand anything from her. He simply stood there, patient, his presence calming in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, everything seemed still. The tension, the confusion, the chaos inside her, it all quieted. It was a brief, fragile moment, but it was enough to make her realize how desperately she had been craving it without knowing. "What is happening to me?" The alien woman pulled her hand back abruptly, as if touching him had burned her. She quickly masked the emotion that flickered across her face, but the human had already noticed. His gaze softened, but he said nothing, as if he understood the turmoil she was feeling. She clenched her fists, trying to regain control, trying to shut off the emotions swirling inside her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. But as she stood there, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The heat that had started as a strange pull had now become something much more intense, something that made her feel alive. The human took a small step closer, his eyes watching her carefully, and for a brief moment, the alien woman allowed herself to relax just a little. She couldn't explain it, but when he was near, the sense of chaos inside her seemed to settle, as if his presence alone could calm the storm she had carried within herself for centuries. And then, without warning, she felt it again. That warmth, that intensity. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. This time, it wasn't just the warmth of his touch. It was something deeper, something that went beyond physical sensation. Her body responded before her mind could catch up, a flush rising on her skin, her heart racing faster than it ever had in battle. She had never experienced anything like this, never known a feeling so powerful and overwhelming. No, this isn't possible. This can't be happening. Her thoughts were jumbled, her mind unable to keep up with the overwhelming sensations coursing through her. She tried to step back, to regain her composure, but the heat inside her only intensified. It was as if her very being was reacting to him in ways she had no control over. You're making me feel something," she whispered, her voice low, tinged with disbelief. The human, still calm and steady, took another step closer, this time closing the distance between them completely. His presence enveloped her, not with pressure, but with a quiet, steady energy that felt like a soft breeze on a hot day. "I'm not doing anything. You're the one who's feeling it." Her body responded instinctively, her pulse quickening. The realization that she wasn't in control of this sensation made her want to retreat, but there was no place to run. Every inch of her being screamed at her to shut it down, to push him away, but the other part of her, the part she had been ignoring for so long, was yearning for it. It wasn't just physical desire, but something deeper, something raw. She could feel her resistance weakening, the walls she had spent centuries building around herself crumbling bit by bit. What is this? Her mind screamed for answers, but the truth was becoming painfully clear. She had never allowed herself to feel anything like this before. Her entire existence had been about power, about keeping others at arm's length, about controlling her emotions. But now, in the presence of this human, she couldn't fight it. She felt alive in a way that terrified her. The human didn't say anything else. He simply stood there, letting her process what was happening. He didn't force anything on her, didn't demand more than she could give. His patience was maddening. And yet, it was exactly what she needed. The alien woman closed her eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath, trying to regain control. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that had taken root deep inside her. She had always been a warrior, but now she felt like she was fighting a different kind of battle, one she didn't know how to win. She opened her eyes and met his gaze again, this time with something new in her expression. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't anger, it was vulnerability. "You've changed me," she said softly, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. The human smiled gently. "I didn't change you. You changed yourself. You just had to let go." For a moment, the alien woman stood there, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his words. Let go. She had spent her entire existence refusing to do that, refusing to feel anything that might make her vulnerable. But here she was, standing in front of a human who had made her question everything. He hadn't taken her strength from her. He had shown her a new kind of strength. One that came from embracing her vulnerability, not hiding from it. And despite all her instincts telling her to fight it, to push him away, she couldn't deny the truth that was blooming within her. The alien woman wasn't sure how it happened, or why it happened, but she realized something she never could have imagined. She wanted more. Not just of him, but of this, of feeling, of connection, of being seen for who she truly was, without the weight of her armor, without the fear of showing weakness. And for the first time, she didn't fear it. Acceptance and transformation. The alien woman stood still, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The air around her felt thick, charged with a kind of energy she couldn't fully explain. She had spent her entire existence trying to control everything, her emotions, her actions, her very sense of self. She had prided herself on being a warrior, a conqueror, someone who never showed weakness. But now, standing before this human, everything she had once believed about herself felt fragile, slipping away like sand through her fingers. Her thoughts were tangled, her heart racing, as the weight of the moment settled in. She had been fighting this, fighting him, fighting herself, but now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what she was fighting against anymore. The war within her had ended, but it had left her with more questions than answers. She had felt the pull of something beyond her control, a feeling she had never wanted, yet now could not ignore. She had feared this. She had feared the very idea of giving up her control, of exposing herself, of being vulnerable. It had been the one thing she could never allow, until now. The human's presence, his calm acceptance, had opened something in her that she couldn't close. The feelings inside her had grown too powerful to deny. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said softly, the words almost foreign on her tongue. She had expected to feel shame, or fear, or anger, but instead, there was only a strange sense of peace. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of him, and not of herself. She had spent so long running from the parts of herself that felt too human, too weak. But standing there, facing the human who had shown her this new side of herself, she realized that those parts weren't weaknesses at all. They were a source of strength. The human smiled, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You're who you've always been. You've just never let yourself see it." His words settled around her like a soft cloak, warming her against the coldness of her old doubts. Who had she been all this time? Was she truly just a warrior? Or was there more to her? Was there a place for her to be both the powerful alien queen and something softer, more connected to the world around her? The alien woman closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her past, the endless battles, the pain of domination, the isolation of power, begin to shift. She had always thought that being invincible meant being alone, but now she felt that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection, from allowing others to see her, and from being willing to share herself without fear. She opened her eyes and turned to face him, the human who had unknowingly guided her through this transformation. She had always thought she was the one who did the teaching, who had the power to shape and mold others. But in this moment, she realized that she had been learning all along. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of awe and wonder. The human stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "No, you can't. But that doesn't mean you've lost anything. You've only gained something more." The alien woman felt a surge of emotion she hadn't known was possible, something warm, something pure. She had always been a force, a weapon, but now she felt something deeper stirring within her. It was the recognition of herself, not just as a queen, not just as a warrior, but as a person. Someone who could feel, who could love, who could be vulnerable, and yet still remain strong. She reached out, slowly, cautiously, and placed her hand on the human's chest. The sensation of his heartbeat beneath her fingers was so simple, yet it felt like the most profound thing in the universe. She had never allowed herself to feel connected to anyone like this before, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I never knew it could be like this," she murmured. The human smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the same realization. It's not about power or control. It's about being able to stand beside someone, to share what you have without fear. For the first time, the alien woman felt her heart steady, not with the adrenaline of battle, but with the quiet peace of acceptance. She had always thought that to be strong, she had to stand alone, but now she knew that true strength came from allowing herself to connect, to feel with others, without the need to dominate or control. The change within her was profound. She had evolved, not just as a conqueror, but as someone who could experience life fully. She had been afraid to be vulnerable, to expose the softness she had hidden away. But now she knew that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of her true strength. "I don't need to be alone anymore," she whispered, her voice full of something new, something human. The human didn't speak, but his hand gently cupped hers, a silent affirmation. The alien woman, who had once ruled with an iron fist, now found herself holding onto something far more precious, the ability to truly live. The galaxy was vast and full of unknowns, but for the first time in her life, the alien woman knew that she didn't need to fight to survive anymore. She had already found something greater than any victory. She had found herself. And with that realization, she knew her journey had only just begun.